The ire of Irene. The massive hurricane barrels up the East Coast and flies over the biggest city in America. From the Carolinas to New England, some streets are flooded. Millions have lost power, and that power could be out for days. Irene's no longer a hurricane, but it's a storm that still has miles to go. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Scott Pelley at CBS News headquarters in New York. Good morning. Irene is making her New York debut. She hit land here just before 9 this morning in Coney Island, downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical storm, but still packing winds of up to 65 miles an hour. Irene first made landfall in North Carolina yesterday as a Category 1 hurricane, and on her trek up the East Coast, she has brought heavy rain and flooding and left millions without power. At this hour, the center of the tropical storm is centered north of New York City. Highest sustained winds are now 60 miles an hour. The storm is moving north-northeast at about 26 miles an hour. The storm is blamed for at least 10 deaths in 5 states, including 2 children. More than 4 million homes and businesses up and down the East Coast are without electricity, and more than 11,000 flights have been canceled, potentially affecting millions of travelers nationwide. This morning, airports in New York, Newark, New Jersey, and Philadelphia remained closed. We have a team of correspondents deployed throughout the hurricane zone all along the East Coast. CBS News Chief National Correspondent Byron Pitts is on the south shore of Long Island, east of New York City, in the city of Long Beach. Byron? Byron Pitts, can you hear us in New York? We've had some difficulty with our communications because of the hurricane.
Scott, the people here in Long Beach are feeling awfully grateful at this hour. This morning at this point, Irene is little more than a stiff breeze. As one man told me, quote, "I've played golf in worse weather." We did, however, get our first taste of Irene at about 6 o'clock this morning. By 9 o'clock, we are experiencing wind gusts north of 50 miles an hour, a steady rain for about 3 hours. Across Long Island, more than 300,000 households have lost electricity. Despite a mandatory evacuation, though, a number of people decided to stay and watch Irene up close.
Now, we're out here because of work. What's your excuse?
I just wanted to see it. See how crazy it was down here with the waves, the wind, how high the water was. I've never seen anything like this ever.
What do you think of it so far?
This is it's a sight to see if you have the guts to come down and see it. I don't recommend it though.
County officials are out making their damage assessments. In Nassau County, there are places where flood waters are 4 feet deep. At this point, folk are out now walking along the boardwalk, enjoying the afternoon, grateful that Irene didn't do more damage here. Scott?
Byron, thank you very much. Moving off the beach into the city now, Jim Axelrod is at the crossroads of the world, Times Square. Jim, the storm has come right up Broadway.
It has, Scott, but frankly, it didn't hit New York nearly as hard as was predicted. There was enormous concern that the hurricane-force winds were going to create problems, especially with the skyscrapers, glass being shattered and so forth, but turned out to be just that, really, concerns. Not that the city won't have its share of problems from this storm. Irene pounded the New Jersey shoreline this morning. The boardwalk in Belmar, New Jersey was torn up as Irene's arrival coincided with a high tide. Storm surge is the main threat for New York City. Low-lying areas of Manhattan are protected by a seawall and a system of pumps, but with predictions of surges up to 8 feet, they may not be enough. Wind gusts toppled trees in Brooklyn. More than 100,000 are without power in New York City, 50,000 in Westchester County, more than 150,000 on Long Island, and more than 160,000 in New Jersey. 370,000 people were ordered out of low-lying areas in New York City. The streets all over were empty this morning as most people heeded the warnings from New York's Mayor Bloomberg.
Everyone should now go inside and be prepared to stay inside until weather conditions improve.
This is the first time ever a natural disaster has shut down New York City's transit system, the country's largest.
Right now we're heading to 1700 Fulton Street.
On the streets of Brooklyn last night, a team from a volunteer ambulance corps was doing its part to get to people who needed help, working Bedford-Stuyvesant, one of New York's toughest neighborhoods.
There's so many ways to get injured, and somebody got to respond to them. The city's going to be overwhelmed, so we have to do it ourselves.
Now, Scott, at this hour, it is still unclear what, if any, flooding damage New York City's subway system has sustained. Mayor Bloomberg originally said it might be until Monday at the earliest until the transit system was back in operation, and that was without any cause or fear of flooding. So still going to check that out as the day unfolds here and see just how bad the subway system has been hit. Scott?
Jim, of course, Manhattan is connected to the mainland by bridges and tunnels. I wonder if any of those bridges and tunnels have closed.
Well, intermittently. For a while, for instance, with the George Washington Bridge, there's both an upper and a lower level. The lower level was closed overnight. The upper level, they were waiting, I think the winds were at 60 miles per hour before they were going to consider that, and we never had really sustained wind forces over that would have caused the upper level to be closed. The Holland Tunnel, one tube at least, was shut down temporarily because of flooding. Traffic was diverted to the other tunnel in and out of Manhattan, Lincoln Tunnel, but the Holland Tunnel's now apparently back open. So again, we'll see as the day unfolds what happens as the flooding threat and the storm surge threat manifests itself here in Manhattan.
Major arteries onto the island of Manhattan. Jim Axelrod at Times Square, thank you very much. Joining me now, CBS News hurricane consultant David Bernard in Miami. And David, I wonder, where is this headed and how ferocious is this storm at this point?
Well, Irene still has a little bit of fight left in it, Scott. Let's take a look at the latest information from the Hurricane Center. And it's a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm. It's racing away from the tri-state area, though. It's moving north-northeast at 26 miles per hour. Here's how it looks on the radar this morning. And the heaviest rain, the big flood threat now, is upstate New York and most of New England. You can kind of draw a line right like that. So from New York to Philadelphia and south, most of the rain is ending and the heavy rain threat is just about over. These are some peak wind gusts since midnight, an average of about a 60-mile-per-hour wind gust in New York City, 46 Atlantic City since midnight, Montauk 40, and so far the winds have gusted to 47 in Boston. Those numbers there, they might come up just a little bit more. So going forward, I think for the rest of the afternoon, it's that rainfall in New England that we're going to have to keep the closest eye on. Still, there's a coastal flood threat, especially on the east end of Long Island and in southeast New England.
We've talked a lot over the last few days about the threat of a storm surge coming in off the sea. Has that ended now?
Again, maybe some areas to the east in southeast New England, that's still a possibility. And we'll just have to wait and see how bad it was everywhere. You know, this storm was so big. We are getting reports that there's been significant storm surge flooding overnight as far south still as Chesapeake Bay and also around the Hampton Roads in southeast Virginia. And that's just going to take some time to sort out to see how much damage there might have been.
One of the reasons this storm has been so interesting over the last few days is because, as you were predicting, it was coming all the way up into New England, which is extremely rare. Why did this storm travel up this way? And is there any reason to believe we'll see more of this hurricane season?
Well, the answer to your last question is yes, it's a possibility because the weather patterns are pretty much staying the same and like they're going to be locked in like this for the next month or two. So I do think the East Coast, Florida, those are going to tend to be the most vulnerable areas for a hurricane as we go throughout the rest of the season. And the reason for that is we've had an area of high pressure over the Atlantic, the central Atlantic, that's been unusually strong, and it's been blocking the storms from turning to the east. So that path is generally straight from south to north. Generally, when the hurricanes get, say, close to New England or, say, the New York area, they'll feel a strong jet stream from the west and it'll blow them out to sea. But that wasn't the case with Irene.
David Bernard, our hurricane expert in Miami, thank you so much for helping us with these last several days. CBS News early show anchor and New Jersey native Chris Raggi is on the Jersey Shore this morning, and he is in a special vehicle that is wired to go live. There's a little bit of a delay between the studio and his vehicle, but we will turn you over now to Chris Raggi and see what he is seeing there on the Jersey Shore.
Scott, thank you very much, Scott. Yes, we are in a unit called Mobile 2, and basically with a unit like this, we don't need a satellite dish, so there's none of that wind resistance like putting an umbrella up in a windstorm. Basically, if you can get a cell phone out, you can broadcast. We're in a place called Spring Lake, New Jersey, which is called the Jewel of the Jersey Shore. That's its nickname. It's one of the most popular Jersey Shore destinations. And I just want to show you real quickly some of the flooding that this area is dealing with now. This is a cross between a huge pond, which is out in that direction called Wreck Pond, and the ocean. And the two combine, and there's some water that comes down from one of the nearby townships, and it causes all this flooding. I want to show you some video from earlier. We've been actually here in South Jersey since about 1 p.m. yesterday afternoon in our Mobile 2 unit, basically taking in as much video as we could. And again, with this technology, we were able to be here on Ocean Avenue, which is this main drag I'm driving on right now, which runs right along the coastline here in the Jersey Shore, the entire distance. It runs for miles, as a matter of fact. So we were able to stay up and broadcast late last night and early this morning when the conditions were at their worst here at the Jersey Shore. The wind was coming down. The tide, obviously, the storm surge had inundated most of Ocean Avenue, which, like I said, is this boulevard right along the Jersey Shore. As we continue driving right now, and I'm not sure if we're still watching video pictures or if we're back live, I'm going to take you to this boardwalk area. And the boardwalk along.
Well, a little bit of difficulty communicating with Chris Raggi there. In these storm situations, our video uplinks are often interrupted by the storm itself, so we've lost Chris. But you got a pretty good idea of what it looks like along the Jersey Shore now. A lot of folks are getting out on the street. It looks like this is more of a mess than a disaster. It looks like there's going to be some flooding and probably quite a few wet basements in that area. So our thanks to Chris Raggi on the Mobile 2 news truck. Joining us now with the latest is the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. And Governor, let me ask you, what are you seeing this morning?
Well, Scott, we endured quite a storm here. The hurricane came on land in Little Egg Harbor in New Jersey very early this morning. We have over 500,000 people without power. We have 15,000 people in shelters right now through 45 shelters across New Jersey and over 250 road closures. But the good news is that it looks as if initially the destruction on our coastline is less than we thought it might be. And I think the loss of life is minimal. And I think it's because we moved 1 million people off the Jersey Shore in 24 hours without incident, 24 hours before this hurricane hit. And so with the exception of one report we've gotten of loss of life, which was off the coastline, so far I think we've achieved what I wanted to achieve first and foremost as governor, which was to minimize the loss of life. And right now we know of only one death.
So mostly what you're seeing there in New Jersey is flooding. I take it that there's not a great deal of damage to buildings, for example.
So far, Scott, we don't see that. I'm going to be taking a tour this afternoon of the entire Jersey coast to take a look at what kind of damage we have down there. But I think it will not be as much wind damage as it will be flooding damage. And that can happen. That's happening both on the coastline and as it progresses over the next day or two inland in our rivers, which given all the rain that we've had leading up to the storm, we're going to have major, if not record, flooding.
I wonder how long the power is going to be out.
Well, the good news is that the storm moved through here rather quickly once it got here. And so we're going to be able, I think, very soon this afternoon to early this evening, get crews out on the road to begin to restore power, work on the downed trees and the downed wires. So, I can't predict exactly when everyone will have their power back, but we're going to get working on that this afternoon. We've been in contact with the power companies, and they're poised and ready to go.
You mentioned that about 1 million people were moved out of the low-lying areas there along the coastline. When will those folks be allowed to come home?
I'm going to be making those decisions, Scott, in the next hour or two, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get them home tonight.
This storm appears to be, at this moment, Governor, much more of a mess than a disaster. I wonder, in retrospect, if you have any regrets moving that many people out.
No regrets at all, Scott, because the best way to ensure there was no loss of human life on the New Jersey coast was there to be no human life on the New Jersey coast. And I have no regrets about it at all. My first and most important job as governor is to protect the lives of the citizens of this state. And so I have no regrets at all moving those folks. And we're going to make sure that we get them back as quickly as possible, but we're going to get them back alive. And that's the most important thing.
And the very next steps that you have to take as governor to recover from this?
Well, we have to make an assessment of the damage. We have to continue to assess our swelling rivers. We may need to evacuate people from our low-lying inland areas that are around rivers, the Passaic River, the Raritan River, the Ramapo River. We may need to evacuate people and deal with those hardships as well in the next 48 hours. But here's the message for New Jersey. I think we have come through this well. Everyone, all of us worked together. Those evacuees left voluntarily. They listened to the call. And you know, New Jerseyans are really tough, gritty people, Scott. And I think they've come through this well. And in the days after this, we're going to help each other to make sure we rebuild our state to where it was.
Chris Christie, Governor of New Jersey, thank you for your time, sir.
Scott, thank you very much.
And CBS News coverage of Irene will continue in just a moment. Back now with our special coverage of Hurricane Irene, now downgraded to a tropical storm as it moves into New England. Nora O'Donnell is at the White House, where President Obama has been getting updates on the storm. Nora?
Scott, that's right. In fact, the president is right now getting a briefing from his senior emergency response team about the very latest information. And he's getting that via White House teleconference with many of these officials who are all throughout the government and working on this. I actually spoke with the president's chief of staff, Bill Daley, this morning, who told me that this storm is not as bad as they thought. Obviously, there's a lot of trees down, power outages, those sorts of things, water damage. But it's not the catastrophic concern that they had and that they had, quite frankly, prepared for. I think it's important to note, too, that the Obama administration was really determined to avoid any comparisons with the failed federal government response to Hurricane Katrina. So President Obama made a very public display of his engagement on this issue. He returned from his vacation a day early. Yesterday, he went to the headquarters of FEMA, where he talked not only with the head of FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, but also a lot of the governors and state and local officials. So that was key, certainly, for this president. He has received multiple updates. I think it's also important to note, too, that even before this hurricane made landfall, the president had declared an emergency disaster area, and everywhere from North Carolina all the way up to New Hampshire. And of course, that clears the way for federal financing and, of course, support to go to many of these different local areas. So a very different response from this White House than Hurricane Katrina. And as when I spoke with the president's chief of staff this morning, I said, wow, there was a lot involved in all of this. And he said, better safe than sorry. And so there's certainly a sigh of relief this morning as the president is right now getting the latest from all the federal officials involved in this. Scott?
And Nora, when the president is briefed by those officials, who exactly is doing the briefing? Where does the president get his information?
Well, he's getting it via teleconference, and everybody from the head of the Department of Homeland Security to his White House advisor on Homeland Security, and even the head of FEMA is involved. But interestingly, I'm told this morning that a number of the cabinet secretaries are involved. So the energy secretary is on this call this morning, briefing the president about the power outages. The transportation secretary briefing the president about when trains will resume up and down the Northeast, when all the planes and those flights are going to resume. And then I'm also told that the Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, is involved in the call this morning. There were real concerns, of course, in New York City that this flooding could affect the markets tomorrow. So Geithner is also the Treasury Secretary involved on that, letting the president know that all things look pretty good this morning.
A lot of moving parts at the White House. Nora O'Donnell, thank you very much. Irene first made landfall, of course, yesterday in Cape Lookout, North Carolina. Then it traveled up the East Coast. The damage and destruction that it caused are just now becoming clear. Correspondents Chip Reed, Begad Shaban, and Mark Strassman have spent the morning checking all of it out. First, Chip Reed in Ocean City, Maryland. Chip?
Well, good morning, Scott. Damage is so minimal here in Ocean City, Maryland, that they've decided that they're going to open the beaches, and they allowed residents and businesses to come back into the city this morning at about 9 a.m., and they're going to allow vacationers to come back at noon. The first positive sign came overnight when winds maxed out at about 60 miles an hour instead of the 90-plus officials had feared. At daybreak, the National Guard and city police searched for damage, finding almost none. The flimsy exterior of this building came crashing down, and sand was piled up on the boardwalk, but no injuries were reported, and there were no calls to 911. Beach erosion was minimal. Ocean City replenishes its beaches every 4 years. The last time was 2010, when they spent $9 million to build up dunes to protect against major storms, dunes that are still standing today. Charles Ketzel, who owns a bicycle rental business, rode out the storm with no problems. Ketzel says he's unhappy with city officials for ordering the evacuation of 200,000 vacationers at the height of tourist season. But Mayor Rick Meehan defends his decision.
You have to err on the side of public safety. You have to do the right thing. Those are hard decisions to make, but they were the right decisions.
As you can imagine, Scott, there's tremendous relief here in Ocean City. The mayor said they didn't just dodge a bullet, they dodged a missile.
Chip, looks like the sun is breaking out there. I wonder how long it's going to be before folks can come back to the beach.
Well, they said they are going to open the beach today. There are already some people out there walking on the beach. They've said they are going to restrict access to the water, but there are surfers out there already, and yesterday the police went up and down the beach chasing them away. Today, they're just letting them surf.
Chip Reed in Ocean City, Maryland. Thank you, Chip. Begad Shaban is in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the casinos closed for only the third time in more than 30 years. Begad?
Well, Scott, the rain seems to have let down just a bit. The winds are certainly still here as Hurricane Irene brings waves crashing here on shore. In fact, there were some wooden paths that took you straight to the sand, but now here on the beach, they're all in pieces. Inland, however, Irene did bring a lot less devastation than officials initially feared. Really, the biggest concern on this barrier island was storm surge, essentially rising water coming from the back bay. And while neighborhoods did get some water, it only inundated a few streets and flooded just a couple of basement apartments. Really, the biggest blow to Atlantic City just may be a financial one. Hotels and casinos are closed. They were actually ordered to shut down in anticipation of the storm, really keeping away paying customers in a city that's usually filled with tourists. According to the New Jersey governor, 1 million people were evacuated from the Jersey Shore, and those who rode it out here at home actually woke up to really nothing more than a few broken streetlights, power lines, and trees. And then near the boardwalk, really you're just looking at it's lined with pieces of wood. Believe it or not, this actually used to be a structure where you could come and rent beach chairs. Now it's just completely gone when Hurricane Irene came in here with winds up to 75 miles per hour. And right now there are still 100,000 residents part of that emergency evacuation order here in parts of Atlantic County. And they still can't return home, although there are crews right now that are out, Scott, trying to get a better assessment of damage and find out just when it will be safe for them to arrive.
Begad, thank you very much. Remarkable to see those casinos empty. It's also remarkable to see Grand Central Terminal here in Manhattan without a soul in the Grand Concourse. All of that because the trains and the subways have been suspended during the emergency. Now we go to Mark Strassman in North Carolina at Kill Devil Hills. Mark?
This was where Irene hit first and hit hardest, Scott, and I can tell you that the Outer Banks are still here. Yes, there's flooding. Yes, there's damage. But all in all, this area came through in very good shape.
On the south side of the Outer Banks, flooding is the new Irene worry. This storm pushed ashore a wall of water and this sailboat with it. Many residents here face a long Sunday of cleaning up yards and pumping up basements.
We have ocean overwash, we have flooded roads, we have fallen trees throughout the whole east, and we continue to have damaging storm surge.
For 12 hours, Irene churned over North Carolina's coast, at first with 115-mile-per-hour winds, and by the time it left, dumped 7 inches of rain. Such a massive storm, the eastern third of this state felt it. In New Bern, 50 miles inland, this mansion burned, and insurance agents will take claim calls all day. Bob Whitmore found 7 feet of floodwater in his basement.
We are most definitely happy to see Irene travel north, although we wish the best for them through this as well.
The good news, there's damage, but not a landscape of destruction. By and large, North Carolina took Irene's best punch, even holdouts like Carol Dillon. On the Outer Banks, this 82-year-old motel owner never leaves during hurricanes. During Isabel in 2003, USA Today put this photo of her on its front page. She stayed again through Irene with no regrets.
Don't have any significant damage. Very lucky. Somebody did a lot of praying, including me.
In coastal Wilmington, the New Hanover Regional Medical Center delivered 17 babies. None of them was named Irene. Kristen Elliott named her newborn Georgia Ann.
They had me in the room, no windows or anything like that. So besides the lights flickering a couple of times, it just really wasn't that different.
The real worry here wasn't the Atlantic flooding behind me, but storm surge on the west side of the island, the sound side of the island. And yes, that area did get flooding. But the concern that perhaps it would maroon these barrier islands and cut off folks here from mainland North Carolina, that did not happen. Yes, the roads here can be impassable at times, but the bridges here are either open, Scott, or about to reopen.
Mark Strassman on the beach at Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina. Updating Irene's status now, it is a hurricane no more, weakening to a tropical storm after making landfall on New York's Coney Island this morning. Irene is now blowing across New England with 60-mile-an-hour winds. At least 10 deaths in 5 states are blamed on the storm, and more than 4 million homes and businesses are without power. You're watching CBS News coverage of Irene strikes. We're back now with CBS News special coverage of hurricane and now tropical storm Irene. Irene made landfall this morning in New York as a tropical storm. It is now moving across New England. Highest sustained winds are about 60 miles an hour. Irene first made landfall in North Carolina yesterday as a Category 1 hurricane. Moving up the East Coast, it caused flooding and blew down power lines, leaving millions without electricity. Irene is blamed for at least 10 deaths in 5 states, among them 2 children. More than 4 million homes and businesses have lost power, and more than 11,000 flights have been grounded. That translates to travel problems for millions of people nationwide. We have a team of correspondents deployed throughout the hurricane zone all along the East Coast. We go first to Elaine Quijano in New Jersey's Long Beach Island.
Hello, Scott. Well, here in Long Beach, people are just beginning to venture out and officials are just beginning to assess the situation. And while the worst certainly appears to be over here, at its height, this storm was a harrowing ordeal.
Go, go, go! As water from Irene pushed over Long Island, Steve Iorio tried desperately to push it back.
You got how many people working just this one building?
Well, we have 3 people here right now. We have another 3 people in another property. We have probably 15 people altogether working tonight.
The only thing separating the property he manages from a wall of Irene-driven water is a sand dune that's holding for now.
Do you feel like you might be fighting a losing battle here?
Well, this is the reason why we're setting up these pumps now. We're trying to stay ahead of everything. So I have another building I need to go to, similar to this building, which will set up another pump, you understand, and try to stay basically ahead of it.
But in low-lying communities like Long Beach, staying ahead of the water has been a losing battle. Floodwaters spilled over the beach here and poured down street after street, while Irene's strong winds littered neighborhoods with debris. With a mandatory evacuation order in place, the normally bustling summer getaway town was a ghost town, with many homes and businesses boarded up. About the only place open was a local gas station, where pump attendant Mohammed Sarwar said business was slow.
Have you had any customers at all this morning?
To now, no. To 6 to now, no customer.
And now the cleanup begins. Officials say there are at least 120,000 people without power here in Nassau County alone. Scott?
Elaine, I wonder how things look going forward today. Are people going to be allowed back down to the beach? Looks like there are a lot of folks on the boardwalk already.
It does. In fact, those folks who decided to stay instead of obey the mandatory evacuation order have certainly been out and about already this morning. The atmosphere here is very casual, I have to say. A lot of the people who are out now don't seem to be particularly traumatized in any way, shape, or form. In fact, most of them do seem to be quite amused, but other folks that we certainly came across this morning are breathing a sigh of relief, very much so. The fear here was really the storm surge that had been predicted to be a possible risk of 4 to 6 feet. It did not materialize as far as we can tell, at least not in our area here. And so as a result, you're seeing a lot of people simply out enjoying the view right now.
Elaine Quijano in Long Beach, New York. Thank you very much, Elaine. New York City prepared for the worst, shutting down the mass transit system, the largest in the country, and ordering an evacuation of low-lying areas around Manhattan and other places in the city. But the worst didn't come. In fact, the stock exchanges say that they plan to open for business as usual tomorrow. Jim Axelrod is north of Wall Street in Times Square.
Well, Scott, you know, right behind me, we've got a rugby team from Australia just wrapping up a little exhibition here, which gives you a sense of what the mood's like here at Times Square. Contrast to a couple of hours ago when this place was absolutely deserted, didn't see anything but the occasional police vehicle going by. So in New York right now, the feeling is, yes, there was a bullet dodged, but we don't want to mislead anybody. It didn't take much to find some trouble in and around the New York metropolitan area. For instance, let's show you some pictures we have from Elmsford, New York, in Westchester County, and you get a sense that while people are certainly enjoying the aftermath now, there was some serious business earlier today, a rescue being performed of some folks out there in Westchester County and Elmsford. You know, the big concern at this point has nothing to do with the winds and the rains. It has to do with the potential for flooding, especially in the low-lying areas of Manhattan, Battery Park, the South Street Seaport, places where Mayor Bloomberg had ordered the evacuation of 370,000 people, not all of whom followed the orders, of course, but those are the areas where people are going to want to take a look and see what's going to happen with the potential for flooding. Now, we're getting news, as you reported, that the financial markets will be open for business tomorrow. But the big concern in the Wall Street area is, you know, salt water and electricity are not a good mix. And while there is an extensive network of underground pumps and there's a seawall protecting lower Manhattan, until the threat of the storm surge subsides, obviously the big concern is going to be what happens if the water is such that it cannot be contained by the network of pumps and you end up with extensive flooding.
Jim, earlier today I was down in probably the lowest part of Manhattan, all the way down at the tip of the island around the Fulton Street Fish Market, and the water there was only about as high as a bumper of a car. So flood tide is going out now at this point, so the water's probably only going to get lower. Jim, I wonder, the mayor closed the subway system, stopped all the buses and all the commuter trains at noon yesterday. When do we expect all of that to get started again?
Well, Mayor Bloomberg has said that when he closed it, that maybe the earliest you might see the transit system, the country's largest transit system, reopening would be on Monday, because it's not just the question of flipping a switch and starting to see the subways running again. Under the best of circumstances, it certainly won't be until later today, possibly tomorrow. But again, we don't have real good reporting yet on the extent to which there might be some flooding in the subway tunnels. We know earlier, for instance, that one tube of the Holland Tunnel was closed and it's been reopened, which is a positive sign, an optimistic sign, meaning that perhaps the flooding is as bad as it was going to be in a tube like the Holland Tunnel. But we're just going to have to wait and see how this plays out with the subway system.
Holland Tunnel, a major thoroughfare, major artery into the island of Manhattan. Jim Axelrod, thank you so much. There at Times Square, which seems to be filling with people again. We want to check in now with our CBS News hurricane consultant David Bernard in Miami. David, what do we expect from the rest of this tropical storm?
Well, let's kind of set the stage now, Scott, and we'll start by looking at radar. And again, as we could see from Jim Axelrod in Manhattan, things have gotten a lot better there. And it's basically dry from a line from New York south. So it looks like New England, that is where The heaviest rain is going to be for the rest of the day. And right now, I am estimating there could still be locally 6 inches plus in parts of New Hampshire, Vermont, upstate New York, and going into Maine as we go through the afternoon and tonight. And then the rain amounts are going to drop off drastically as you head through the 95 corridor through New York, Philly, and it's about done around Dover and also D.C. Now, the wind is still an issue. We still could see throughout the afternoon some gusts close to hurricane force. Most areas will see tropical storm force winds indicated in yellow there, meaning winds between 40 and 60 miles per hour. And so I think the story going forward the rest of the afternoon and tonight is that the biggest problem is going to be power outages and then also flooding due to heavy rains.
Everyone was concerned about the storm surge coming in from the sea, but we were talking to Governor Christie a short while ago, and he was saying that his worry now is that rivers are going to flood. Low-lying areas of New Jersey are going to flood because this rain is going to continue for some time.
Yeah, it's a big concern, and of course there's a lot of rain that has fallen upstream, and that'll all be coming down not only today but over the next couple of days. So with the rising rivers, those flooding concerns are very valid, and that's going to extend not only in the Northeast but right through the Delmarva into the Mid-Atlantic, where they've had tremendous rains in Virginia and North Carolina. It didn't really stop raining there until sometime last night.
The fascinating thing about this storm, the reason we've been paying so much attention to it over the last several days, is how far north this hurricane came. Very unusual for this kind of storm. I wonder if you could help us understand why that was and whether we can continue to expect that sort of thing as hurricane season unfolds.
You know, Scott, nature has a way of repeating itself, and it's been repeating itself the last month or so with this pattern that's setting up in the Atlantic, with this blocking high that was in place to the east of New England. That was preventing the storm from basically going to the east. It had nowhere to go but to the north as it gained latitude. That's typically not the case with hurricanes. The further north they get, usually we see a glancing blow to New York or New England, and they scoot out to sea. It's very possible that a pattern like that could remain in place for the final couple of months of the hurricane season. And the big rains that we saw in the Northeast all throughout August, they weren't even from a hurricane. Those are also due to that same pattern, keeping it wet and cool in the east for the foreseeable future.
David Bernard, our hurricane expert in Miami, thank you so much, David. Millions of people, or certainly well over 1 million people, were ordered to get out of Irene's way. And among them were the residents of Long Beach, New York, on the south shore of Long Island. Despite the danger, some chose to ride out the storm at home. Byron Pitts is among those who rode out the storm. Tell us what's happening in Long Beach this morning, Byron.
Well, Scott, we just got an update. More than 450,000 households and businesses have lost electricity on Long Island. That does appear to be the worst of it. As for here in Long Beach, there was a mandatory evacuation order, but many people decided to stay behind. They waited until the 11th hour, but by early this morning, the Lassiter family in Long Beach had seen enough.
We're expecting this place to be pretty washed out when we get back.
Long Beach got its first taste of Irene at 6 this morning. This time yesterday, 100 yards of pristine beach separated the boardwalk from the ocean. Not now. With the ground long saturated by a month of record rainfall, trees fell easily. Power lines and street signs bear the signs of high winds. In these conditions, ordinary objects can cause damage and create danger. Still, many people took risk. There were the familiar scenes and the familiar reasons.
It's a sight to see if you have the guts to come down and see it. I don't recommend it, though.
Despite a mandatory evacuation, the Long Beach city manager estimates a third to a half of his citizens stayed home. All right. And who all's here? You got
I have a house full of company. Come on, Julian, Brendan in here.
Cheryl Rand hosted a hurricane party overnight at her second-floor Ocean View apartment.
We have our refrigerator loaded with non-perishable foods and stuff.
You could feed the whole town.
Yes, I could.
One neighbor brought his dog. Julie Carrigan brought her 8-year-old son, Brendan.
I felt safer here than I would have if I drove Brendan someplace aimlessly.
This is your first hurricane, right?
Yeah.
What do you think? You nervous? You impressed? What?
I don't know. I think I'm nervous. I have no idea.
There are a few spots in Nassau County where the flood water is about 4 feet deep, but that appears to be the worst of it. And Scott, interesting enough, there's a major surfing tournament scheduled for Long Beach on September 1st. There are a number of professional surfers in town. I talked to a few a while ago, and they said they can't wait to get back in the water today.
Byron, looks like surf's up there behind you. You know, in the videotape that you were showing us, it looked like the water was rather high in a lot of parts of Long Beach. I wonder whether that's beginning to subside now. Is it draining at all?
Oh, it is, and it's draining well, Scott. There were places here, as I mentioned earlier, where the water was 4 feet deep, and in some of those places it's gone down considerably. Even here, for instance, where we are on the boardwalk. About 3 hours ago, you couldn't see the beach because it was just ocean water from here straight up to the boardwalk. Now, as you can see, that's pushed back. There are people out on the beach now. I've seen people walking their dogs, taking pictures. I saw one guy get in the water, but the police encouraged him to get out.
Things improving dramatically in Long Beach, New York. Byron, thank you very much. Irene's next target after New York is New England, and Wyatt Andrews is in Mystic, Connecticut. Well, we're having a little trouble with Wyatt's microphone in Mystic, I see. It looks like the sea behind him is relatively calm and there's not a great deal of wind. But when we get Wyatt's microphone back up, we will come back and check in on how the storm is doing in Mystic, Connecticut. CBS News coverage of Hurricane, now Tropical Storm Irene, will continue in just a moment. The remnants of Hurricane Irene, now a tropical storm, have been pushing north from New York into New England, and we now have Wyatt Andrews in Mystic, Connecticut. Wyatt?
Scott, I'm in Mystic, Connecticut, which is about 120 miles east of New York City, and we're in some of the heaviest winds that we've faced so far. Most of the low-lying areas of southern Connecticut that we toured this morning were 1 to 2 feet underwater. You might not be able to tell, but the boats floating in this harbor, many of them anyway, are riding 2 to 3 feet above the level of their docks and piers. And this is not because of Irene's rains. This is Irene's storm surge.
The leading edge of Irene struck here early this morning with gale force and tropical storm winds. Those are not unusual for New England, but the timing of Irene's impact was unusual.
This is the storm surge that struck southern New England. It was 6 to 9 feet from southwestern Connecticut to the eastern tip of Massachusetts, and it came ashore right at high tide.
Fear of that 9-foot surge led the U.S. Navy on Friday to send all 4 nuclear-powered submarines from their home port of Groton, Connecticut, out to the safety of deep water. All low-lying areas of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts are under mandatory evacuation orders, but we noticed many people riding it out, and most of the people we spoke to said they were used to gales and to the floods and are taking Irene in stride. So far, there has been 1 fatality in Connecticut, none in the rest of New England, but 2 dangers remain. While damages to boats and property on the front side of the storm will be significant, it's the back side of the storm that's now more worrisome.
That backside could bring 6 to 10 inches of rain to places like western Connecticut, western Massachusetts, and Vermont. And the governors here in New England are warning there could be heavy flooding yet to come, noting that historically that backside flooding has been more deadly to New Englanders than any front side to any storm. Scott?
Wyatt, I have to ask, you said that the docks are underwater. Well, then where are you standing?
Right. Scott, the crew was smart enough to put me on a floating dock. And historically, that's interesting because 20 years ago when Hurricane Bob beached hundreds of New England commercial fishing boats, many of the harbors here switched to floating docks.
And they work. Thank you very much, Wyatt Andrews in Mystic, Connecticut. The storm has disrupted travel throughout much of the East Coast, and that's had a ripple effect all across the country. Armin Katayan is following that part of the story. Armin?
Scott, normally this is one of the busiest travel weekends of the year with vacations and college students headed back to school. Now Irene has thrown all of that travel and more into a grinding halt. All along the eastern seaboard and beyond, every major form of transportation had called it quits, shut down, going nowhere fast.
It was chaotic. The lines were crazy. The staff were very, very tired. Everyone was impatient.
In a travel weekend to remember, or better yet, forget, 4 major airports, 3 in New York, plus Philadelphia, completely closed. Boston and Washington were barely operating. In Pittsburgh, Linda Cunningham and husband Dave were headed to Europe.
We're supposed to land in Brussels tomorrow morning at 7:35. So we may be still in Philadelphia tomorrow morning instead of in Brussels.
In all, airlines scrapped more than 5 figures worth of flights this weekend, 6,600 on Sunday alone, affecting millions of passengers from Maine to San Francisco. Some travelers took Irene in stride.
When you get as old as me, I'm not on a schedule.
So you're like, it doesn't matter.
I'm really open to change.
Others, not so much.
Just ridiculous. They got nobody working here.
Much of Amtrak's system was off the rails. All passenger service suspended in the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and New England regions through at least today. That includes trains between Washington and New York, Boston and Portland, Maine, and the entire state of North Carolina. Service as far as Chicago and Montreal affected. It was hard to say what city got it worse, but the Big Apple seemed the biggest loser. All area airports down, the nation's largest mass transit system, home to some 7 million riders a day, completely closed for the first time in history. Not a bus or even a cab in sight.
I went from train to bus, and now I might try private limo. Maybe horse and carriage might be my only way out.
Travel is expected to resume in some of the affected parts of the country today, but as one airline official told me, Scott, it's a guessing game right now when things are going to get back to normal.
Thank you, Armin. Continuing with our blanket coverage up and down the coast, we now have Whit Johnson in Maryland checking in on what Irene did there. Whit?
Well, Scott, we're here in Annapolis, and of course, everybody here remembers Hurricane Isabel back in 2003, the 7-foot storm surge and the flooding in the downtown area that came with it. This time, forecasters say the winds caused sort of a reverse tidal effect, so we did not get the flooding here, and instead we had widespread power outages. In this area alone, 44% of the people who live here were without power at one point. Let's take a look at some of the total numbers from Hurricane Irene. In Maryland, about 822,000 people were without power. Virginia, some 900,000. North Carolina, 525,000. And of course, these numbers are ticking up and down by the minute for a total of more than 4 million people without power as a result of Hurricane Irene. And Scott, the main reason here is toppled trees, the dangerous combination of the torrential rain and the high wind gusts as high as 80 miles per hour in some places. The rain saturating the soil, and the wind has come and toppled those trees, and it's really been a dangerous combination. In fact, we've seen most of the deaths have been because of fallen trees. So power companies, despite the conditions, they've been out there braving the elements, and they are working to restore power. Baltimore Gas and Electric reports that they've already restored power to more than 100,000 people, but they're reminding people, be patient. All of the elements that we are struggling to get through, they are as well, and it could be days before all of the lights come back on. Scott?
Whit, thank you very much. Power, of course, being one of the more difficult parts of all of this and one of the longer lasting effects of Hurricane and now Tropical Storm Irene. Bob Schieffer is our chief Washington correspondent and anchor of Face the Nation. Bob has been following the federal government's response to the storm. Bob, what have you found out?
Well, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, had a news conference just concluded just a while ago, and she pretty much put a fork in this thing. She said that it is safe to say, these are her words, that the worst of the storm, at least up to and including New York and New Jersey, has passed. The storm will proceed up through New England this evening and out of the United States by late tonight and early tomorrow morning. She says that precautions that were taken by government officials at every level really kept down the casualties here. And I think credit where credit is due. I think that's exactly right. We got lucky on this one, Scott, in that we had a whole lot of advance warning. But I think the important thing here is that government officials did take those warnings seriously. Nobody wanted to see a repeat of what happened during Hurricane Katrina. There were meetings, there was coordination from the White House right on down to mayor's offices in various parts of the affected areas, and in the end it all paid off. I think there are probably going to be some people who will complain that they shouldn't have been evacuated when their governments ordered them out of certain areas, but the fact of the matter is casualties were very, very low this time around, and I think these preparations and this planning had a lot to do with it.
Very different effect this time, Bob, than in Hurricane Katrina.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Scott, and I think Katrina is a big reason for all of this. You know, everybody remembers, Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job, and all of the things that the government was saying back in the wake of Katrina. But the fact is, the government was very, very slow off the mark after that disaster, and people at every level this time around, Scott, were determined that that wasn't going to happen again. We always have the so-called lessons learned after these kinds of things, and I think in this case you can say the government learned something from Katrina, and it worked out pretty good.
Bob Schieffer, Chief Washington correspondent, thank you very much. We all remember those scenes from Hurricane Katrina where so many people were trapped in the Superdome during that time, many without food and water, trapped there for days because the evacuation was not underway early enough to avoid the breaching of the levees. As we continue to track Irene, we want to take a look back now at some of the images from the storm's journey up the East Coast, from the Carolinas to New England, and the work of our reporters who've been covering it for you.
Let's get out of here. Let's get out of here. Grab the mic.
We got our first real taste of Irene at about 6 o'clock this morning, and she's only intensified since then.
So we've actually got our first real damage report here of the morning. We're in Belmar, and look in front, you can see we've got parts of the boardwalk that have come up that have now made their way onto the street. We're actually going to be very careful.
This is the storm surge that hit southern New England. It was 6 to 9 feet from Connecticut to the eastern tip of Massachusetts.
We just had a wind gust here of 71 miles an hour, according to Southampton Town Police.
So this is your home, huh? Yes. When were you in it, first of all, when the trees came down?
Yeah, that tree came down around 3 o'clock, and then the other tree came down around 5.
The wind is becoming much stronger here. When sustained winds reach more than 50 miles an hour, all emergency operations in Ocean City will cease.
We've got several types of flooding here in Rockaway. This is fresh water. This is fresh rainwater that has bubbled up through the sewers.
Up north more. This is probably the worst I've seen since Floyd.
The big concern on Manhattan Island this morning is storm surge.
If the rest of the East Coast comes out of this as well as these barrier islands did, they should consider themselves lucky.
Irene, a very unusual storm coming this far north. As the remnants of Irene cross through New England, more than 4 million homes and businesses are without power throughout the storm region. The death toll is now at least 14. CBS News will be tracking the storm and its impact in the hours ahead. We will have updates throughout the day and a full report, of course, on tonight's CBS Evening News with Russ Mitchell. For the very latest online, go to cbsnews.com. For now, for all of us at CBS News, I'm Scott Pelley. Good day.